Hello and welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Kevin Simmons, author of Refractions of Light, 201 Answers on Apparitions, Visions, and the Catholic Church. Also, we'll talk about his other book entitled Pope Leo XIII and the Prayer to St. Michael. Both interesting topics for EWTN viewers. Welcome, Kevin, to have you here on EWTN's Bookmark for the first time as an author. People will recall that you were on last summer with Father Mitch, talking about basically your book on refractions of light and on apparitions. And let me ask you, you're a convert to the Catholic Church. What made you focus on a topic on apparitions?
Well, it's part of my background, Doug. I was always had kind of an eye for all things mystical, and that was part of how I came into the church. I had cousins that were helping me along in the process, and they would talk to me about apparitions, visions in the church, and things of that nature. And then as I got into my theological studies, I developed that interest a little bit further by more, kind of forming it and melding it with the formal theology of private and public, divine revelation. And thus subsequently, after graduation, I got more into the topic by working with specific cases of private revelation and meeting like-minded individuals and just having a go at it.
Okay, the beginning of the book here, you say, there's a quote from Pope Benedict XVI, "We do not announce a gospel of prosperity," obviously we hear about that sometimes today, "but Christian realism. We do not announce miracles as some do, but the sobriety of Christian life." It's interesting because Catholics to some degree get accused with the apparitions and the miracles of being very much into this kind of supernaturalism all over the place, etc. But in some ways what this book tries to show is that the Church is very cogent on and very meticulous in how it deals with these kinds of situations, right?
Yes, it is. Very, very meticulous.
Right. Now, what's also interesting here, you have a quote by Peggy Noonan. I'm not sure why you decided to take Peggy, but she said, "John Paul made you burst into tears. Benedict makes you think." What do you think Francis makes you do? And why did you put Peggy Noonan's quote in there?
Well, first let me begin with the reason for the Peggy Noonan quote. She made that quote around the time where I was beginning to write the book, and it was during the pontificate of now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. And it struck me because there was a lot of hype about Pope John Paul II's mysticism, and Pope Benedict was more of your intellectual type, or so the characterization goes. And I thought her quote was very sobering, just in keeping with the theme of my book of let's talk about these things rationally and see how the Church goes about discerning these things. So I thought her quote kind of had a balancing act in that particular thing. It set a good tone for the rest of the book.
Right, and before you get into the Q&A, in a preface you say, "For the past several decades there's been a notable rise in people claiming private revelations." Is that really true? I mean,
yes, there has been.
And how do we know that? The Church has had people coming to it, or where have we seen that?
Well, there are numerous news reports, especially with the proliferation of mass media and the various means of it. More and more people are claiming, "I'm talking to Jesus and Mary," or "I got a message for whoever under the sun."
We hear about it because of the web and the internet, and people can blog and get the information out.
Exactly, instantaneous information.
Right.
And so with these constant proliferations of these claims, people have become confused, in my humble opinion, and they don't really know how to discern these things, and so that's my book. That's what my book is about.
Right. You talk about has led to confusion, sensationalism among Catholic faithful, and because of insufficient catechesis, important tenets of the Catholic faith. And you go on to say, in order to dispel some of this confusion, I've written this book to clarify teaching on Church private revelation. Do you think sometimes you've dealt with people, and even when you were on with Father Mitch, people have these particular visions, or they've heard about some particular thing, and then you have to kind of tell them, well, you need to understand that in context, or that hasn't been approved, and to some degree some people feel let down.
Yes, they do. That's why a few years ago I wrote an article after a trip to Ireland called "The Greatest of Pastoral Care," in which this book was published after that, but it's not reflected in it in a strict sense. But the point of the article is we need good pastors of the Church that understand how to guide souls in that pastoral care. And this book is one way to kind of help give them the tools to empower both the pastors of the Church as well as the average layman through Q&A format, just to have those tools so that You don't always necessarily have to rely on the pastors of the church when it is unnecessary. You'll have the tools in your own mind to be able to help
So this
yourself.
level of discernment, which so many people are concerned about today, on understanding how do I discern God's will, how do I discern what I'm seeing in light of church teaching, especially when sometimes there's a lot of confusion over what the church might teach.
Exactly.
You say holiness is the goal of private revelation. How so?
Well, private revelation is meant to shed light on divine revelation to help us understand it better. And if the goal is to get to heaven, well, we get to heaven by being holy. And so that's the essential connection that I see in this, in connection to the spiritual life.
You say thereby leading us closer to God. The focus is never on the private revelation, but on the public mystery. So
Yes.
we've got a mystery and got a revelation. So what's the difference, and you talk about in the book, between something that is publicly revealed and something's privately revealed? What does the church mean by that?
Well, public revelation is that the revelation of God's his self-disclosure to all men in both Scripture and tradition, either tradition being written or oral. And private revelation refers to all of the various mystical phenomena such as apparitions and visions, locutions, etc., since the death of the last apostle and the closure of the New Testament.
Now, you talk about the idea that they should shed light on the deposit of faith, the private revelations, rather than on casting their shadow over it. Have you seen instances where that was the case?
Yes. There are people, for instance, here in these United States, who have made certain apparitions essentially their faith, and they pit those apparitions against the church, and they kind of use it as to bludgeon, for instance, the Holy See or even the local bishop.
Right, exactly. Now, you divided the book into three parts: Q&A, appendices, and endnotes. Why so, and what does each one contain?
Well, the Q&A was designed with the Baltimore Catechism in mind. It was a very effective tool back in the day, and still is for those who use it. Very quick and effective for helping people understand. So I decided to use that format, but not maintaining a strict catechetical theme with it. And then the appendices were important documents, some of which had not been seen in English translation, and I thought it was good to bring them into English so that people can see and read for themselves. And then the endnotes, in keeping with scholarly standards, to provide either further commentary or to show people what my sources were.
Right. You say in order to communicate this history and lore, much time and effort was spent in finding, transcribing, and translating many documents. Did you find anything new and surprising for yourself when you actually went to the original source material and translated them into English?
Yes, I did. With one of the claims that's come up in more recent past, it involves Pope Urban VIII. Allegedly, he allowed private revelations to be disseminated without
and that's
prior
one
approval.
of the questions in the book, right?
Yes.
Right.
And so when I actually dived into the history, I said, actually, he kind of said the exact opposite, and here are the two documents that discuss that.
Right. You say, utilizing the greater context of Catholic theology, I've also brought to the subject my own contributions. And you kind of talk about how you were trying not to do that, but then you felt like you were forced to do that. Why?
Well, because it becomes a little bit too intellectual and too stuck in head or in theory. And so I said, okay, I made a distinction between approved private revelations and unapproved private revelations. Approved ones I would mention by name, unapproved ones not necessarily. And then if something needed a little extra further commentary just to elucidate the point better, I made that as an endnote in the back of the book.
Right. You also talk about a particular era that the churches had to deal with over time, and I guess continuing, and maybe even more so today, which is really Galatians 1:6-9, which is talking about the claim to another gospel. So in your research, are you seeing a lot of that with what we're hearing about today as well?
Yes, there has been a lot of that, especially more so in the past. Nowadays, I've noticed it's become a lot more subtle. Subtle differences that require a very attentive eye and ear to the theology present behind what is being stated.
Is the theory then behind it you can get a little bit off and then you slowly drift away without realizing
yes,
that
it's
that
like
it's
the
taking
frog
you
in the
a different
water
direction. Right.
analogy.
It's a slow kind of thing, not quite as over your head.
Yes.
No, not as easily identified. Older Catholics might remember the index of forbidden books and the system of censorship it engendered. I vaguely remember that because I'm old. But that's the kind of thing that we kind of get pummeled with sometimes, either by mainline Protestant churches or even by fundamentalists. Where these forbidden books that were stopping people from reading. Some people thought the Bible was on the list of forbidden books there, as far as they're concerned. So, what was it? Why was it something the church needed to have, and why did we get rid of it, and there's anything that replaced it?
Well, I'll fast forward a little bit through some of the history, but it begins at roughly about the time of when Gutenberg invented the printing press. People began to publish things without regard for prior screening or scholarly or academic standards. And fast forward about 100 years, around the time of the Council of Trent, it was decided that so many of these books were beginning to be published, or other documents, and the church decided to keep a list known as the Index of Forbidden or Prohibited Books. And if a book got on that list, it was because there was some defect in faith and morals, or would otherwise harm faith and morals in the average Catholic.
Right.
And so for 400 years, the church maintained this list and updated it. And then in the 1960s, Pope Paul VI, as a part of the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, decided to make a distinction with it, and he removed the legal force under canon law. He said, however, that it was meant to retain its moral force. So a book on that list, Catholics are still not able to read without having proper training or catechesis, and perhaps in some cases permissions from the appropriate authorities.
Unfortunately, the way it tends to work is once they say legally there's nothing wrong with it, then people assume that morally there's nothing wrong with it.
Yes, yes.
And the nuance gets lost in the sauce.
Yes.
Exactly. Now, when you get into your questions, you say that this book is designed for any Catholic to read, regardless of the theological training. So did you, when you purposely were writing the answers to these questions, thinking, how can I make this so that the average person can understand what I'm talking about, but not turn off somebody who has got maybe a little more background in the faith?
It was a very difficult balance, Doug. And I think the way that it goes best is just the flow of it. I tried to begin from one point and end almost seamlessly, but you can tell that I can almost create section breaks with respect to the topics for discussion. So it kind of breaks up the monotony a little bit, but it still flows and everything builds upon each other. So by the time you get to question 201, you have a lot that kind of goes into it that provides that necessary context.
It gives you the background so you can understand as you move forward. You talk about the church has a process to discern alleged private revelations. What are the negative criteria? You talk about there's positive criteria and negative criteria in dealing with private revelation.
Sure. Well, in 1978, the Holy See issued privately to the pastors of the church a document called Norme Sacrae Congregationis, Norms of the Sacred Congregation, in which it gave different criteria to go by, as well as the different processes to help the pastors of the church to discern private revelations. And the church gave two criteria overall, positive and negative. And some of the negative criteria involve things like psychological imbalances, were there grave sins. It doesn't specify necessarily all kinds of grave sins, but things like sexual or financial impropriety, things of that nature.
Right, exactly. The alleged visionary gravely sins, the alleged demonstrates psychic disorders, evidence of gain or profit, strictly related to the fact of that. And then he also talked about positive. But let me jump ahead to this. There must be vigilance taken against human additions in alleged private revelations. What does that mean?
Well, there's one thing to receive the revelation from God, the private revelation. It's another for a visionary to comment upon it and add their own personal reflections to it. And the church says we have to be very careful about that and make sure that we know what are the very words of whoever is appearing or whatever they're seeing versus the commentary of the person receiving it.
Right, because obviously they subjectively took that in, now they're subjectively replaying it, and you can get, even if they don't intend to change what it is, they could possibly do that. And certainly there's always a case that somebody could decide to. Yes. Yeah, a lot of people embellish stories in their own life if it sounds better or makes people happier with what they're saying.
And of course, time changes memories a little bit, and we think things a little bit differently. And as we continue to grow and educate ourselves, we see things from a deeper perspective. And that's one thing that happened, for instance, with Fatima. Sister Lucia, as she got older, she started to, she learned how to read and write, for instance, and then she began to read more of like church documents and listen to the words of the Holy Father and see the history of the 20th century develop. And she could see Our Lady's words being fulfilled, despite the fact that she already knew how it would manifest itself in some way.
And again, sort of greater insights to that. Exactly what there was more meaning in there than what she as a shepherd girl could take in at that point in time. This was an interesting thing. Under the positive criteria, what is meant by capacity for returning to the normal regime of a life of faith?
When people can people can go to extremes in their religious practices and devotions. And when people claim to be receiving private revelations, sometimes they can go really off the reservation, as it were. And the basic idea is, do we find them doing common things like praying the rosary, going to daily mass, or are they starting crusades or doing extraordinary fasts that are just weakening and killing themselves? You know, or is it overboard, overkill?
Right, exactly. There's a section here on page 24, it goes through a couple, but it says, why is it that the faithful can trust if they so choose, is the term. Because you make out the point that the faithful are not bound to believe in alleged private revelation. So that's the question. It's approved, this private revelation is approved, but I don't have to believe in it. What does that mean?
The Church teaches that we are not obliged to obey or to believe in any particular private revelation. The Church leaves it up to us to accept something in our lives if after it has been approved, that is. And the reason for it is because the Church is here to guard and defend and teach the deposit of faith, divine revelation. That is what we are called to believe. So we are not obliged to believe in it, but the Church also says we shouldn't be so light to disregard something. It is a help, the Church says, that is offered to us by God in a particular moment of human history, but one which we are not obliged to use.
You say if a claimant was to become corrupt later in life, would that call into question the earlier approved revelations? And you have an example of one of the people related to La Salette.
Yes. Later in life, the two visionaries of La Salette, they fell into disrepute based upon some things some behaviors or actions that they had done. And so it kind of cast a shadow on those earlier revelations that were affirmed by the local bishop. As a matter of fact, there's been some efforts recently, I understand, to try to go deeper into that history and find out a little bit more, get some more perspective on exactly what happened. Okay. But that's the general idea, is it doesn't affect those earlier revelations, but any later ones do get called into question.
Okay, later on you say, the person asked the question, if the Church is infallible in matters of faith and morals, how is it possible for her to make an error regarding the supernatural character of a claim to private revelations, or can it do that?
The Church does not enjoy infallibility when it comes to private revelation, only with respect to divine revelation. And so, take for instance the case of the Divine Mercy devotion in St. Maria Faustina Kowalska. Right, her writings were actually on the index, they were forbidden under order of Pope St. John the 23rd. And interesting fact, the document that was signed by Monsignor Hugo O'Flaherty of Scarlet and the Black fame, and 20 years later, then Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, Cardinal Wojtyła, came across new information and realized, wait, there were some bad translations here.
Exactly.
And so he reopened the case, and 6 months later he became Pope.
Some of the distinctions between her talking about herself versus talking about our Lord or whatever, there was some confusion in how it was done.
Yeah, I'm not too sure of all the particulars, but
yes. Something along that. Let me ask you just quick before we get to your other book on the St. Michael prayer, two things that will help a person hopefully understand that what they're reading, the Church is at least having some regard for it in a positive way. Let's talk about two things. One is called a Nihil Obstat.
Yes.
What is that? And also, what's an Imprimatur and what's the difference?
Well, this is a very strong sticking point after the reform of the 1983 Code of Canon Law there, in 83. The Nihil Obstat and the Imprimatur are two marks from the competent authority to judge these matters that says that this book is free from faith and morals and can be published. Prior to the reforms of Pope Paul VI, with the system of the index, a book that touched upon faith and morals, good morals, had to be approved by the competent church authority. After the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, there was reforms done to that system, and I hate to say it, they were not very well understood and or implemented by the general populace of people. And there was a claim saying that, well, we no longer need that because of what Pope Paul VI did in 1966. Well, I went back and I looked at the documents and I said, actually, he said quite the opposite. You know, the system of censorship with the just review of a book and the Imprimatur was maintained, and so the point is, legally, we are not compelled by force of law, but Pope Paul VI wanted, in an address to the Holy Roman Rota, he indicated that he wanted to encourage the people not by precept, but by living their faith. And so working with the pastors of the church, they would do these things of their own free will. You know, it was a good idea. I don't know how well it went over, but you know, that was the idea in the Holy Father's mind at the time.
Right, and Nihil Obstat means what?
Without obstacle.
Okay, and an Imprimatur would mean?
Let it be printed.
Okay. Okay. Doesn't mean that they agree with every point that's made in there, but there's nothing necessarily against the faith. Now let's move on from Refractions of Light to Pope Leo XIII and the prayer to St. Michael. Mother was a big fan of this prayer. It's been said on EWTN. We always say it at Mass. It used to be said, and then it wasn't said anymore. What changed?
Well, in the 1960s, there was the reforms, the liturgical reforms being implemented after the publication of the conciliar document Sacrosanctum Concilium. And the group that was tasked to begin to review the documents and begin the implementing, they said that the prayers after Mass that were said, after Low Mass it is, were now to be, it was either suppressed or omitted, I don't remember what the Latin word was. And so from 1964-65 onward, those prayers were no longer said publicly after Mass. People may have continued to recite them privately if they so wished, and still may do so. But as far as officially, by law, no, they were no longer required.
Now it's interesting too, because I think a lot of us have heard the story, and you've got it right here. The account varies, but the basic story has it that one day this Pope Leo XIII was in the Vatican when he suddenly received a vision, allegedly of a conversation between Jesus and Satan. During the conversation, the latter requested 100 years or so to test the church. Christ permitted this, gave over the 20th century to Satan, and to that end. The experience is said to have so frightened Pope Leo that he composed the now famous prayer to St. Michael, the Archangel, and your entire book goes to reinforce that story, but it doesn't. So now, did that story not exactly happen, or you have multiple versions of how it sort of happened? What was your focus, and why did you decide to pursue that course?
The particulars changed with each different version, but my focus was more, did Leo have a vision, and was that the reason for the prayer? I can state, beyond a shadow of reasonable doubt, that yes, there was a vision. We don't know all of its content. We actually know very little, at least in accordance with the documentation that is available at this time. But that's the nuts and bolts of it. So the particulars, like did he fall, did he collapse, did he freak out, did he panic? I can't necessarily speak to that.
Was it 100 years, or was it 60, 50, or 60 years?
In the literary tradition, it was 50 to 60 years, not 100 years or a century.
Right. Okay. So change. Now, the prayer to St. Michael was part of a series of prayers that were said after Low Mass from 1886. And you mentioned that Pius's immediate successor, modified the prayer. So there were actually prayers going on before Pope Leo XIII in this.
Yes.
Explain that.
At the time in the 19th century, the Papal States were under attack from the revolutionaries that had spread from the French Revolution and that were being instigated by the secret societies such as the Freemasons and the Carbonari. And so the Holy Father wanted to have people to pray for the security of the Papal States and Pope's intentions. So he instituted 4 different prayers to be said after Mass. 1858, 1859, I believe, were the years for that. And then after his death in 1878, his successor, Pope Leo XIII, refined those prayers. He himself was a very competent Latinist, and he refined them, made them more elegant. And then in 1886, he revised them again, only 2 years after he revised them, which for me, researching this, that was very significant because the church moves rather slowly, and for him to suddenly do, he gutted those prayers and it revised quite a bit, included that prayer to St. Michael.
Something happened.
Something happened.
That prompted him to do that.
That quickly, yes.
Okay. Now, in the preface, you've got Bishop Athanasius Schneider, who's fairly well known and has been here at EWTN. He said, as the threshold of the 20th century, a century of unheard of militant atheism and anti-human monstrous political regimes, Pope Leo XIII gave the Church the famous prayer to St. Michael the Archangel. It's a very powerful prayer of also he gave a very powerful prayer of general exorcism against the infestation of Satan and evil. So were there actually 2 different things he did?
There were 4.
4 different things, okay.
Yes. By year, it was 1886, 1888, 1890, and 1899, roughly.
Okay. And so one was the prayer we say after Mass that we kind of note today. When was that finally, the version that people would tend to say or think of as the St. Michael prayer today?
That was the 1886, the first one.
Okay. And so were the other ones related to that, or were those other prayers related to the idea of a broader exorcism?
I believe that they were related. I don't know from within the documents, I haven't seen anything from Leo that shows, yes, they stem from that earlier experience. But looking at the evidence, my private opinion is yes, I believe that they're all related.
And this is the second edition of this book that's out now, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have another book in the works?
Well, I was recently accepted by my diocese as a seminarian, and so I have to focus on formation, and so no future book projects, but I will be continuing to hopefully maintain and kind of fine-tune existing ones.
Great. We'll pray for you as an author and for your vocation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin Simmons, for stopping by EWTN's Bookmark. 2 interesting works, Refractions of Light, 201 answers on apparitions, visions, and the Catholic Church. A lot of people have questions about that. And something interesting, Pope Leo XIII and the Prayer to St. Michael, both available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. EWTNRC.com is the place to find it. You'll find us right here on EWTN next time on Bookmark. We'll see you then.